The unlikely encounter. The courtroom was as imposing as it was silent, with its high ceilings and cold, echoing walls. Rows of benches were filled with people murmuring quietly as they waited for their cases to be called. At the front, the judge's bench loomed like a throne, and behind it sat Judge Elias Thorne, a man renowned for his no-nonsense demeanor. Among the sea of faces, a young black woman named Alia Harper clutched the hand of her 7-year-old daughter Zuri. Alia's heart raced as she waited for her name to be called. Her nerves weren't just because of the courtroom's intimidating atmosphere. Today's hearing was about a series of unpaid parking fines, totaling over $300. For someone like Alia, every dollar counted, and she didn't have any to spare. Alia wasn't careless or irresponsible. She was a single mother trying to make ends meet. Life had been a string of challenges ever since Zuri's father disappeared from their lives when Zuri was only a baby. Alia worked 2 jobs, one as a cashier at a local grocery store and another as a nighttime cleaner for office buildings. Even with all her effort, money never stretched far enough. On the surface, Alia seemed calm, but inside, she was anything but. She had practiced her explanation countless times in front of her bathroom mirror. She wanted the judge to understand her predicament. She wasn't ignoring her fines, she simply couldn't afford to pay them. But from everything she had heard about Judge Thorne, mercy wasn't his strong suit. Case number 4875. Alia Harper. The clerk's voice rang out, breaking Alia's train of thought. Alia squeezed Zuri's hand one last time and whispered, "Stay close to me, okay?" Zuri nodded, her big brown eyes scanning the room with curiosity. She didn't fully understand why they were there, only that her mom seemed very stressed. Alia stepped forward, Zuri clinging to her side. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, judging her even before she spoke. The whispers from the audience were audible enough to reach her ears. "Another one trying to dodge responsibility," someone muttered. "She doesn't stand a chance with Judge Thorne," another voice whispered. Alia's cheeks flushed, but she kept her head high. She approached the bench, where Judge Thorne sat with his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He was reviewing her file, his expression unreadable. "Miss Harper," he said in a deep, commanding voice, "you are here today regarding unpaid parking fines totaling $320. Do you dispute the charges?" "No, Your Honor," Alia replied, her voice steady but soft. "I don't dispute them. I just—" Before she could explain, Judge Thorne raised a hand to silence her. "We'll get to that," he said curtly. "First, let's review the facts. You parked in a no-parking zone on 3 separate occasions. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alia admitted, her palms sweating. The judge leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. His gaze bore into Alia like a laser. "Ms. Harper, this court deals with facts, not excuses. Parking laws exist for a reason. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor, I do," Alia said, her voice trembling slightly. "But if I could just explain." Before she could finish her sentence, a small, high-pitched voice interrupted. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Zuri said, tugging on Alia's sleeve. The courtroom fell silent. Alia froze, her heart sinking. She had told Zuri to stay quiet no matter what, but now all eyes were on her daughter. She could feel the weight of their judgment. Judge Thorne's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't look angry, just surprised. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting to Zuri. "Excuse me, young lady, what did you say?" Zuri hesitated, looking up at her mother for reassurance. When Alia didn't respond, Zuri turned back to the judge. "I said I'm hungry," she repeated, her voice small but clear. "We didn't have breakfast." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and Alia's face turned crimson. She felt like the ground might swallow her whole. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Judge Thorne held up a hand to silence her. The judge's expression softened, just a fraction, as he addressed Zuri directly. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zuri," she said shyly. "Well, Zuri, Courtrooms can be long and boring places, Judge Thorne said, his tone unusually gentle. But you must know it's very serious business. Do you understand that? Zuri nodded, her curls bouncing. Good, the judge said. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he added, but serious business can wait a moment. Bailiff, please bring some water and a snack for this young lady. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Thorne, the man known for his strict adherence to protocol, had just paused a hearing to feed a child. Aaliyah stared at the judge, unable to believe what she was hearing. Your Honor, that's not necessary, she began, her voice shaking. Nonsense, Judge Thorne interrupted. The young lady is hungry, and we cannot proceed until she's had something to eat. The bailiff quickly returned with a granola bar and a bottle of water, handing them to Zuri. She accepted them with a wide smile and a polite thank you. The judge leaned back in his chair, observing the scene with an expression that was almost amused. The audience, too, seemed caught off guard, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Now, Ms. Harper, the judge said, his tone more measured, let's hear your explanation. As Aaliyah began to speak, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the room. The judge's demeanor was still stern, but there was a glimmer of something else, empathy, perhaps. It was a small moment, but for Aaliyah, it was enough to spark a tiny flicker of hope. For the first time that day, she felt like she might actually be heard. A glimpse behind the curtain. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she began her explanation. Despite the judge's surprising gesture of kindness toward Zuri, his stern demeanor still loomed over her like a storm cloud. She clutched the edges of the wooden podium in front of her, steadying herself as she spoke. Your Honor, she started, her voice wavering slightly. I understand that I broke the rules. I parked where I wasn't supposed to, and I take full responsibility for that. But I need you to understand why. Judge Thorne raised an eyebrow, folding his hands on the bench. Go on. Aaliyah took a deep breath. That morning, my daughter was sick. She had a fever and a terrible cough. I needed to get her medication, and the pharmacy was my only stop before heading to work. When I got to the pharmacy, all the regular parking spots were taken. I panicked, thinking about how I might be late for work and how Zuri needed her medicine. So, I parked in a spot I shouldn't have. The judge's face remained unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. Encouraged by his silence, Aaliyah continued. I was in the pharmacy for longer than I thought I'd be. The line was so slow, and Zuri was in the car waiting for me. By the time I came out, there was already a ticket on my windshield. Her voice faltered as she recalled the sinking feeling of seeing the bright orange envelope under the wiper blade. The memory of the $300 fine, a crushing blow to her already stretched finances, still felt like a punch to the gut. I worked 2 jobs, Aaliyah said, her voice steadying. One at a grocery store and another cleaning offices at night. Even with both jobs, it's hard to make ends meet. That ticket, it's more than I make in a week. The judge's expression didn't change, but there was a glint in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. And why did you let the fines accumulate, Miss Harper? He asked. You could have paid them off in smaller amounts before they reached this total. Aaliyah hesitated. She didn't want to seem like she was making excuses, but the truth was unavoidable. Every time I got paid, Your Honor, something else came up. Groceries, rent, school supplies for Zuri. There was always something more urgent than the parking fines. I thought I'd get to it eventually, but I never could. The judge sighed, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench. Ms. Harper, everyone who comes into this courtroom has a story. Some are compelling, others less so. But the law doesn't operate on emotion. It operates on facts. The fact is, you broke the law multiple times and failed to address the consequences. Aaliyah's heart sank. She had expected this response, but hearing it still stung. She glanced down at Zuri, who was happily munching on her granola bar, oblivious to the tension surrounding her. However, Judge Thorne continued, his tone softening. I also understand that life can be more complicated than the rules allow for. The room went silent. Even the audience, who had been whispering and murmuring throughout, fell quiet. Was the judge about to show leniency? This was unheard of for Judge Thorne, who was notorious for his rigid adherence to the law. Tell me more about your circumstances, Ms. Harper, the judge said. You mentioned working 2 jobs. What kind of work do you do? Aaliyah nodded, grateful for the opportunity to provide more context. I work as a cashier during the day, and at night, I clean office buildings. I've been doing both jobs for about 2 years now. It's exhausting, but it's the only way to keep a roof over our heads. And Zuri? The judge asked, glancing at the little girl. Who looks after her while you work? Aaliyah hesitated. I can't afford full-time childcare, so I rely on my neighbor, Mrs. Franklin, to watch her during my evening shifts. She's been a godsend, but she's in her 70s, and I can't expect her to keep doing it forever. Judge Thorne leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You're clearly doing your best, Ms. Harper, but juggling 2 jobs and raising a child on your own is no excuse for breaking the law. The words hit Aaliyah like a slap. She had hoped the judge might show some understanding, but his response made it clear that he wasn't going to let her off the hook. She braced herself for the inevitable ruling. Then, something unexpected happened. Zuri, who had been quiet since her outburst about being hungry, suddenly spoke up. My mommy works really hard, she said, her small voice cutting through the silence. She makes the best pancakes, but we don't get to eat breakfast together a lot because she's always busy. The courtroom erupted in soft chuckles, and even Judge Thorne cracked a faint smile. He looked down at Zuri, his stern exterior momentarily melting. Your mom sounds like a great cook, he said. Do you like helping her in the kitchen? Zuri nodded enthusiastically. I get to stir the batter. Aaliyah blushed, but she couldn't help smiling at her daughter's innocence. Zuri had a way of lightening even the heaviest moments, and this was no exception. Judge Thorne turned his attention back to Aaliyah, his expression unreadable once more. Ms. Harper, he said, his voice firm but not unkind, I'm going to take a short recess to review your case further. In the meantime, please remain in the courtroom. Aaliyah nodded, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the judge was planning, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. As Judge Thorne left the bench, the audience buzzed with speculation. Whispers filled the room as people debated whether the judge was softening or simply taking his time to hand down a harsher sentence. Aaliyah sat back down with Zuri, her mind racing. She couldn't predict what the judge would decide, but one thing was clear. Zuri's innocent candor had shifted the mood in the courtroom. Whether that shift would work in their favor remained to be seen. As they waited, Aaliyah took Zuri's hand and whispered, You're such a brave girl, Zuri. Thank you for being my little helper today. Zuri beamed, her face lighting up with a smile. I love you, Moni. The words filled Aaliyah with a surge of determination. No matter what happened next, she would keep fighting, for Zuri, for their future, and for the chance to give her daughter a better life. The courtroom doors opened, and the judge returned to the bench. The room fell silent once more as everyone waited to hear what he would say. The judge's reflection. The courtroom grew still as Judge Thorne retook his seat behind the bench. His usual commanding presence was tempered by a thoughtful expression, a rare sight for the man known as the Iron Gavel. Aaliyah's heart thudded loudly in her chest, each beat resonating in her ears as she gripped Zuri's hand tightly. The recess had been brief, but the anticipation made it feel like hours. Ms. Harper, the judge began, his voice calm but firm. Before I render my decision, I'd like to share some thoughts with you in this courtroom. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Was this a prelude to a harsh punishment? She tried to prepare herself for the worst, though the hint of warmth in the judge's tone gave her a sliver of hope. Over my years on the bench, Judge Thorne continued, I've seen countless individuals stand before me with excuses for their actions. Some are valid, many are not. When I became a judge, I swore to uphold the law impartially, without letting personal feelings cloud my judgment." He paused, letting his words sink in. The audience hung on his every syllable, the air in the room thick with anticipation. "But there are times," he said, his voice softening slightly, "when the circumstances behind a case demand more than a mechanical application of the law. Sometimes justice requires understanding the human element, the struggles and complexities that people face outside of this courtroom." Aaliyah blinked, unsure of where he was going with this. She dared not interrupt. Judge Thorne leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the bench. "Ms. Harper, you've painted a picture today of a life filled with challenges. Challenges that many in this courtroom, myself included, may never fully understand. Your actions, while unlawful, were not born out of recklessness or disregard for the rules, but out of necessity. This is not an excuse, but it is context." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a mixture of surprise and intrigue. This wasn't the Judge Thorne they knew, the stern, unyielding arbiter of justice. Something had shifted, though no one could quite pinpoint what. The judge raised a hand, silencing the whispers. "Before I make my ruling," he said, "I'd like to ask you one more question, Ms. Harper. What do you believe justice should look like in your case?" The question caught Aaliyah off guard. She hadn't expected to be asked for her opinion, least of all by Judge Thorne. Her mind raced as she considered her response. She knew this was her chance to appeal to his humanity, but she didn't want to come across as desperate or manipulative. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I believe justice should take into account not just the mistakes someone has made, but the reasons behind them. I'm not asking to be excused for my actions. I know I parked illegally, and I accept responsibility for that. But I also believe that punishment should fit the circumstances." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm trying to build a better life for my daughter. Every day, I work as hard as I can to make ends meet. I don't want pity, and I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want a chance to keep moving forward without being crushed by this fine. If there's a way for me to make amends, through community service or something like that, I'd gladly do it." Judge Thorne nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at Suri, who was now swinging her legs under her chair, completely oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the tension in the room, and it seemed to soften the judge even further. "Your words are thoughtful, Ms. Harper," he said, "and your willingness to take responsibility speaks volumes about your character. But before I finalize my decision, I'd like to share something personal." The audience shifted in their seats, surprised by the judge's uncharacteristic openness. Even the bailiff, who had stood stoically by the side of the bench, seemed taken aback. "Many years ago," Judge Thorne began, his tone reflective, "I was a young father trying to make ends meet. My wife had passed away unexpectedly, leaving me to raise our son on my own. At the time, I was working as a junior attorney, putting in long hours at the firm just to keep the lights on. It wasn't easy." Aaliyah's eyes widened. She hadn't expected the judge to reveal such a personal detail about his life. The audience listened intently, hanging on every word. "There were days," the judge continued, "when I felt like I was failing at everything. My job, my parenting, my life. But through it all, I had one guiding principle. I wanted to give my son a better future, no matter what it took. I see that same determination in you, Ms. Harper." Aaliyah's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside her. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, her struggles unnoticed by the world around her. To hear someone, especially someone like Judge Thorne, acknowledge her efforts was overwhelming. The judge cleared his throat, his voice regaining its usual authority. "This court is not in the habit of dismissing fines, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception. Ms. Harper, your parking fines will be reduced to $50, payable within 60 days. The audience erupted in gasps and murmurs. shocked by the judge's decision. Alia felt a wave of relief wash over her, tears springing to her eyes. She had been prepared for the worst, but this outcome was more than she could have hoped for. Judge Thorne raised a hand, silencing the crowd. However, he continued, "I'm not done. Ms. Harper, I'd also like to recommend you for a local program that provides financial counseling and support for single mothers. The program can help you manage your budget and connect you with resources to make life a little easier." Alia was speechless. She opened her mouth to thank him, but no words came out. Lastly, the judge said, his gaze softening, "I want to commend you for raising a child as bright and spirited as Zuri. She's a testament to your strength and resilience. I hope you'll continue to inspire her as you navigate life's challenges." Zuri, who had been quietly listening, suddenly piped up. "Thank you, Mr. Judge," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. The courtroom erupted into laughter, and even Judge Thorne couldn't help but smile. For a brief moment, the harshness of the courtroom dissolved into warmth and humanity. Alia finally found her voice. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her words trembling with emotion. "Thank you for giving us a chance." The judge nodded. Court adjourned. As the gavel struck, Alia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like it might actually be manageable. And as she held Zuri's hand and walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of hope. The ripple effect. As Alia and Zuri stepped out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind them, Alia exhaled deeply, her breath shaky. Relief coursed through her body like a tidal wave, but it wasn't just relief from the reduced fine. It was the weight of months of stress lifting ever so slightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without the crushing burden of hopelessness pressing down on her chest. "Mommy, are we going to get pancakes now?" Zuri asked, her innocent eyes bright with excitement. She swung her mother's hand, the earlier tension of the courtroom long forgotten in her childlike optimism. Alia knelt down to Zuri's level, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to get pancakes, the best pancakes you've ever had." Zuri beamed, and Alia felt a small pang of guilt. She knew how little they had to celebrate with most weeks, but today wasn't just about food. It was about a tiny moment of joy in their otherwise chaotic lives. As they left the courthouse, Alia couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. Judge Thorne's words echoed in her ears, not just his verdict, but his story. The idea that he had once been a struggling single parent himself, someone who had faced challenges similar to hers, made his leniency even more meaningful. She had expected judgment, but instead, she had received something she hadn't felt in a long time: compassion. The community notices. By the time Alia and Zuri were seated in a small diner across the street, the courtroom story had already begun to ripple out into the world. A reporter covering cases that day had overheard the judge's ruling and Zuri's innocent thank you. She saw the opportunity for a story unlike the usual grim reports of legal battles and scandals. By the time the mother and daughter were savoring their pancakes, the reporter had typed up a quick headline: "Judge shows rare leniency to single mom, inspired by her daughter's innocent plea." Accompanying the article was a snapshot of Alia holding Zuri's hand, her expression one of tearful gratitude as they exited the courtroom. The story spread quickly, first locally, then nationally. It resonated with readers across demographics: parents who understood the struggles of balancing work and childcare, young professionals overwhelmed by debt, and even retirees who remembered their own difficult times. It was a rare tale of humanity shining through the cold lens of bureaucracy. Alia's life takes a turn. Unbeknownst to Alia, the story of her courtroom experience was spreading like wildfire. She was far too preoccupied with her immediate concerns, getting through the week, juggling her jobs, and figuring out how to pay even the reduced fine. Despite the judge's help, life hadn't magically transformed. Her shifts were still long, and her bill still loomed large. That evening, as she was preparing for her night jog cleaning offices, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Assuming it was a robocall, she almost ignored it, but something made her pick up. "Hello, is this Miss Harper?" a professional voice asked. "Yes, this is Aaliyah," she replied cautiously. "This is Melissa Jacobs from the Community Outreach Foundation," the woman explained. "We read about your story in the paper, and I wanted to personally reach out. We have a program designed to assist hardworking single mothers like yourself, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Aaliyah was stunned. I'm sorry. What program?" "It's a comprehensive support program," Melissa explained. "We provide childcare assistance, financial planning, and even opportunities for further education or job training. We'd love to help you take some steps toward long-term stability." Aaliyah could barely process what she was hearing. This wasn't just a small gesture. It was an opportunity to rebuild her life. That sounds amazing," she stammered. "But how did you find me?" "Your story touched a lot of people, Ms. Harper," Melissa said warmly, "including me. We think you deserve this chance." Judge Thorne's reflection. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Thorne sat alone, reflecting on the day's events. He couldn't shake the image of Zuri's bright, innocent smile, or the way Aaliyah's voice had trembled as she spoke of her struggles. It had been years since he had allowed himself to connect so deeply with a case, to see beyond the black and white of the law into the messy, complicated shades of humanity. For decades, he had operated with a strict, almost mechanical sense of justice. Laws were to be upheld, and personal circumstances rarely swayed him. But today, something had shifted. Zuri's candid outburst had reminded him of his own son when he was young, how he had once faced a world of impossibilities with nothing but determination and the love of a parent. He opened the folder he had requested during the recess, the one containing resources for single parents in the area. It was a document he had ordered compiled years ago, but rarely used. Seeing Aaliyah's case had reignited the purpose behind it. He made a mental note to revisit the document, update it, and make it more widely available. For the first time in years, Judge Thorne felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Perhaps the law could be more than a tool for punishment. Perhaps it could be a tool for healing. The unexpected help. A week later, Aaliyah received another call, this time from a local bakery owner named Mrs. Fitzgerald. "Ms. Harper, I run Sweet Harmony Bakery downtown, and I heard about your story. I understand you've been working multiple jobs, including one at a grocery store. I was wondering if you'd be interested in a full-time position at my bakery." Aaliyah's breath caught. "You mean a single job? Full-time?" "Yes," Mrs. Fitzgerald replied. "The pay is competitive, and we have flexible hours. It would give you more time with your daughter." Tears filled Aaliyah's eyes. "I don't know what to say. Thank you." A community rallies. The story's impact didn't stop there. Donations began trickling in from strangers who had read about Aaliyah's struggles. One person offered to pay off her remaining fine, while another donated a year's worth of school supplies for Zuri. A local mechanic even offered to service her aging car for free. Overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, Aaliyah decided to pay it forward in small ways. She volunteered at a community center on her days off, sharing her story with other single mothers and helping them navigate the same challenges she had faced. A new chapter. Months later, Aaliyah stood in her small but newly comfortable apartment, watching Zuri play with a dollhouse donated by one of the community members who had been inspired by their story. She had a single job now, one that allowed her to pick Zuri up from school every day and cook dinner together most nights. She still faced challenges. Life was far from perfect, but for the first time, she felt like she had a foundation to build on. And as she tucked Zuri into bed one night, her daughter looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mommy," Zuri said, "I'm glad we went to see the judge that day." Aaliyah smiled, brushing her fingers through Zuri's curls. "Me too, baby. Me too." A second chance. Weeks turned into months, and Alia's life slowly began to take on a sense of stability she had almost forgotten was possible. The bakery job at Sweet Harmony had become more than just a source of income. It was a refuge. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the small, sunlit shop, and the warmth of the ovens seemed to echo the newfound warmth in her life. Mrs. Fitzgerald, the owner, had not only been a boss but also a mentor, teaching Alia the finer points of baking and even encouraging her to experiment with her own recipes. One day, as Alia was carefully frosting a tray of cupcakes, Mrs. Fitzgerald approached her with a gentle smile. "Alia, I've been watching how you work, and I have to say, you've got a real talent for this." Alia looked up, surprised. "Thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. That means a lot." Mrs. Fitzgerald placed a hand on Alia's shoulder. "I've been thinking, how would you feel about taking on more responsibility here? Maybe managing the shop part-time when I'm not around." Alia froze, the frosting bag in her hand trembling slightly. "Manage? Me?" "Yes, you," Mrs. Fitzgerald said firmly. "You've proven yourself more than capable. You're organized, reliable, and you have a way with customers. I think you'd do great." Tears welled up in Alia's eyes. It wasn't just the offer itself. It was the faith that Mrs. Fitzgerald had in her, the belief that she was capable of more. For so long, Alia had been stuck in survival mode, unable to see herself as anything more than a struggling single mom. But now, for the first time in years, she began to envision a future that wasn't just about getting by. It was about thriving. "I'd love to," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you so much for believing in me." Judge Thorne's decision bears fruit. Meanwhile, Judge Thorne's decision to refer Alia to the Single Mother Support Program had set off a chain reaction. The program, which had once operated quietly in the background, suddenly found itself thrust into the spotlight thanks to the news coverage of Alia's story. Donations poured in, allowing the program to expand its services and reach more women in need. Inspired by the positive impact of the program, Judge Thorne began advocating for similar initiatives in other communities. He reached out to his peers, encouraging them to consider alternative sentencing options for low-income individuals and single parents. His colleagues were initially skeptical. Judge Thorne, the iron gavel, was now talking about compassion and second chances. But his passion was undeniable, and slowly minds began to change. In his quiet moments, Judge Thorne thought about Alia and Zuri. He wondered how they were doing and whether his decision had truly made a difference. He didn't often allow himself to dwell on individual cases. Years of experience had taught him to maintain a professional distance, but this one lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about Alia. It was about the reminder she had given him that the law could be a force for good, not just punishment. Alia gives back. As Alia settled into her new role at the bakery, she found herself thinking about the women she had met through the Single Mother Support Program. Many of them were still struggling, working multiple jobs, and juggling childcare with little to no support. She wanted to help them, the way so many people had helped her. One evening, after Zuri had gone to bed, Alia sat at her small kitchen table, jotting down ideas in a notebook. The bakery had given her access to leftover ingredients that would otherwise go to waste. Flour, sugar, butter. What if she used those ingredients to teach other women how to bake? Not just for fun, but as a skill they could use to earn extra income or even start their own businesses. The idea blossomed into a plan. With Mrs. Fitzgerald's blessing, Alia began hosting weekly baking workshops at the bakery after hours. The classes were free, and they quickly became a lifeline for the women who attended. They learned how to bake everything from simple bread to elaborate cakes, and more importantly, they found a sense of community and support. One of the women, a soft-spoken mother of 3 named Carla, pulled Alia aside after a class one night. "Thank you for doing this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have hope." Alia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We're all in this together," she said. That's what makes the difference. Zuri's growing spirit. While Aliyah was building a brighter future for herself, Zuri was blossoming in her own way. The little girl's natural curiosity and enthusiasm made her a favorite among her teachers and classmates. Her innocent comment in the courtroom had set everything in motion, but Zuri wasn't content to rest on her laurels. At school, she started a small project of her own. Inspired by her mother's story, she convinced her classmates to collect supplies for families in need. "It doesn't have to be big," she told them. "Even little things can help a lot." The project grew beyond anything Zuri could have imagined. Parents, teachers, and even local businesses got involved, turning the initiative into a full-fledged community drive. By the end of the school year, they had collected enough donations to fill an entire classroom with food, clothing, and household items. One day, as they were sorting through the donations, Zuri turned to her teacher and said, "I want to be like my mommy when I grow up. She helps people." The ripple expands. The story of Aliyah and Zuri continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. The bakery workshops inspired other businesses to launch similar initiatives. Judge Thorne's advocacy led to the creation of new programs for struggling families, and Zuri's school project became an annual event, ensuring that no family in their community went without basic necessities. Aliyah's life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, and there always would be, but she had found something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Every cupcake she frosted, every workshop she led, every hug she shared with Zuri was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. And in the quiet moments, when she sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and reflected on how far she had come, she would think back to that day in the courtroom, to Zuri's innocent request for food, to Judge Thorne's unexpected kindness, and to the small spark of hope that had grown into something extraordinary. Sometimes, she thought, all it took to change a life was one small act of compassion. Building a legacy. The air was filled with the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls and the hum of quiet conversation as Aliyah stood behind the counter at Sweet Harmony Bakery, overseeing the bustling morning rush. It had been a year since that fateful day in court, and the changes in her life felt almost surreal. She had gone from juggling 2 exhausting jobs to managing the bakery part-time and leading a series of successful community programs. But the most significant transformation wasn't in her circumstances. It was in her mindset. For the first time, she felt capable, proud, and hopeful. A new beginning. It was a Saturday morning, and the bakery was alive with activity. Zuri, now 8 years old, was perched on a stool by the counter, helping to decorate cookies with colorful sprinkles. She had become a fixture at the bakery, her cheerful presence delighting both customers and staff. "Mommy, look," Zuri exclaimed, holding up a cookie she had decorated with an intricate rainbow design. Aliyah leaned down, inspecting the cookie with an approving smile. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. I think we got a future pastry chef on our hands." Zuri giggled, her eyes sparkling. "Or maybe I'll be a judge, like Mr. Thorne." Aliyah's heart swelled at the mention of the judge who had set her on this new path. She often thought about him and the kindness he had shown that day. His decision hadn't just reduced her fine. It had opened doors she never thought possible. She made a mental note to send him a thank you letter, something she had been meaning to do for months. The growth of a community. Outside the bakery, Aliyah's baking workshops had flourished into something far bigger than she had ever anticipated. What started as a small class for single mothers had grown into a full-fledged community initiative. She had partnered with local nonprofits, offering classes in baking, budgeting, and even basic business skills. Many of the women who attended her workshops had gone on to start their own small businesses, selling baked goods at farmers markets and community events. One of those women was Carla, the mother of 3 who had once thanked Aliyah for giving her hope. Carla had used the skills she learned in the workshops to start a catering business, and she was now providing meals for local events and earning enough to support her family without relying on government assistance. At a recent workshop, Carla had hugged Aliyah tightly and said, "You don't just teach us how to bake, Aliyah. You teach us how to believe in ourselves." Those words had stayed with Aliyah, fueling her drive to keep expanding the program. She had even begun exploring the possibility of turning it into a nonprofit organization, with the bakery as its central hub. Zuri's big idea. Zuri, too, had been busy with her own initiatives. Inspired by the success of her school's supply drive, she had come up with a new idea: a Kids Helping Kids program that encouraged children to raise money and collect items for families in need. With her teacher's help, Zuri organized a series of events, including a bake sale featuring treats she and her mom made together. The bake sale was a resounding success, raising over $2,000 for local families. The event was covered by the local news, and Zuri became something of a local celebrity. When asked how she felt about her success, she replied confidently, "I just want to make people smile, like my mommy does." Aliyah couldn't have been prouder. Watching Zuri grow into a compassionate, driven young girl was her greatest joy. It reminded her that every sacrifice she had made, every sleepless night, had been worth it. A surprising visitor. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Aliyah was finishing up a batch of her signature apple turnovers, the bell above the bakery door jingled. She looked up, expecting to see a regular customer, but her breath caught when she saw who it was: Judge Thorne. He stood in the doorway, looking slightly out of place in his tailored suit, but his expression was warm and genuine. Aliyah wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over, her heart pounding. "Judge Thorne," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled, his stern courtroom demeanor replaced by a kind, almost fatherly warmth. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I've been hearing a lot about you and your bakery." Aliyah blushed, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. "Well, I owe a lot of it to you, Your Honor. If it weren't for your decision that day, I don't know where I'd be now." The judge shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Harper. All I did was recognize the potential you already had. The rest is your doing." Zuri, who had been decorating cookies nearby, ran up to the judge with a bright smile. "Hi, Mr. Thorne. Do you want a cookie? I made this one special." She held up a heart-shaped cookie with colorful icing. Judge Thorne chuckled, accepting the cookie. "Thank you, Zuri. It's beautiful." As he bit into the cookie, his eyes lit up. "Delicious," he said. "You've got a real talent." Aliyah watched the exchange, her heart full. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed since that day in court. What had once felt like an insurmountable obstacle had become the catalyst for a brighter future. Aliyah's legacy. In the months that followed, Aliyah's life continued to flourish. She officially launched her nonprofit organization, calling it Second Chances. The name was a tribute to the opportunity Judge Thorne had given her and the countless opportunities she now wanted to provide for others. The bakery became the heart of the nonprofit, hosting workshops, community events, and fundraisers. Local businesses and community leaders rallied around Aliyah's cause, donating time, money, and resources to support her mission. Judge Thorne became one of the nonprofit's most vocal supporters, often speaking at events and sharing Aliyah's story as an example of how compassion and understanding could change lives. Looking ahead. One evening, as Aliyah and Zuri sat on their couch flipping through a scrapbook filled with photos and news clippings, Zuri looked up at her mom and asked, "Do you think we'll always be able to help people?" Aliyah smiled, wrapping her arm around her daughter. "As long as we keep trying, baby. One act of kindness can change everything." Zuri nodded thoughtfully, then grinned. "Then I'm going to help even more people when I grow up." Aliyah kissed the top of her daughter's head, her heart full. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was beautiful in its own way. And as she looked at Zuri, she knew that the legacy they were building together would continue to grow, inspiring others to believe in second chances and the power of compassion. In the quiet of their small home, Aliyah closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. for Judge Thorne, for the community that had embraced her, and for the bright future she now saw on the horizon.